To everyone with us on behalf of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, I would like to welcome you to the 8th lecture of the John Paul II lecture series organized by the John Paul II Institute for Culture, which is part of our philosophy faculty here at the Angelicum in Rome. This lecture, as well as the entire JP2 lecture series, could not have taken place without the support of our university authorities, Father Michał Pauluk, the rector of the Angelicum, Father Serge Tomat Bonino, the dean of the philosophy faculty, and Father Richard Rybka, the director of the John Paul II Institute of Culture. I would like to thank them all. Special thanks are in order for the founders of the JP2 Institute for Culture and supporters of the St. John Paul II Institute for Culture, and of all the viewers in front of their screens right now. We look forward to the day, hopefully soon, when we will all be together and meet in person. The St. John Paul II Institute for Culture was established to look at the challenges facing the modern world and the church in light of the life and thought of St. John Paul II. The idea of thinking with this great thinker was embodied within this lecture series. They are monthly lectures of eminent interdisciplinary academics who will revisit the extraordinary contributions of John Paul II in our day. Last month, at the 7th JP2 lecture, we had the honor of hosting Professor Chantal Del Sol, who delivered a lecture on the contemporary situation of Christian civilization in the post-Enlightenment world. Within our series for this academic year, in the coming months, we will also have the opportunity to witness lectures by such prominent academics as Professor Renato Christin of the University of Trieste, and finally, Professor Dariusz Gałwin of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Now I'm pleased to give the floor to Dr. Dariusz Karlowicz, the initiator of the John Paul II lecture series, philosopher and editor-in-chief of the Polish Yearly Political Theology, and president of the St. Nicholas Foundation, a strategic partner with the Institute. Dariusz will share more about today's special guest.
Good afternoon, dear friends. I'm honored to introduce to you Professor Remy Brach, philosopher, professor of history of philosophy at the Sorbonne and the University of Louis and Maximilian in Munich. Professor is a renowned scholar of the history of Arabic and Oriental philosophy and philosophy of religion. In 2009, Professor received both the Joseph Paper Prize and the Grand Prix de Philosophie de l'Académie Française. 3 years later, in 2012, he received the Ratzinger Prize. In 2013, he was named Chevalier de l'Ordre National de la Légion d'Honneur, the highest French order of merit. Professor also received an honorary doctorate from Pontifical University of John Paul II in Krakow in 2019. Professor Brach will look today at the foundations of the idea of beauty that emerged from the meaning of Greek and biblical tradition and the revolutionary changes that late modernity introduced in the understanding of beauty. In this context, Professor Brach will ask about the opportunities and threats that the modern context brings to the Christian understanding of beauty and art. Professor Brach, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dariusz. Thank you, Father. Well, my title is The Meaning of Art and Christianity in Modern World. Well, in order to shed some light on the question, we should begin with asking what exactly we mean when we speak of the modern world. There is the continuous flow of time and events, such as historical knowledge endeavors to reconstruct them. Where shall we draw the dividing line? We commonly call the period which came after the Middle Ages modern. Moreover, we commonly distinguish modern history and contemporary history. Retelling modern times from the Middle Ages is not an easy task. The former era is supposed to begin with a so-called Renaissance. But when did this begin? It depends on the countries and even the city-states. The beginning of contemporary history is easier to locate. It is commonly agreed upon to have been the French Revolution and the upheavals that it brought about with the Napoleonic Wars. In German, things become still more tricky, since the distinguished Die Neuzeit from the 16th century on, and Die Moderne, a common moniker for the arrival of new artistic practices, especially in Vienna or in Munich towards the end of the 19th century. Be that as it may, modern times were a peak in the history of art. Already existing arts enjoyed a fantastic flourishing in each and every field and in each and every language area. In literature, the novel appeared with Cervantes. Among the performing arts, the theater, tragic and comic, which had slept in the Middle Ages, with the exception of the Mysteries, enjoyed a rebirth all over Christendom with Calderon, Shakespeare, and the French trio Corneille, Racine, Molière. In music, polyphony appeared together with new genres like the sonata, the cantata, the symphony. Wholly new forms of art appeared, like the opera, which blends theater and music. All those arts had by and large Christian underpinnings. This flourish took place in Europe, hence in a Christian context or background. Hence it is apposite that we should ask what kind of relationship there is between art and Christianity. A historical approach is required, all the more that Christianity is not a doctrine, but first and foremost a fact in history. The fact of Jesus Christ's life, death on the cross, and resurrection. Perhaps it is even the only real event in history, the only thing that really happened and was not merely the reorganization of already existing elements of the world. The doctrine, the Christian doctrine, is an endeavor to do justice to the fact and to translate it into adequate conceptual vocabulary. Well, now, what was the state of art when Christianity became the leading factor in Western culture? Let us first have a look at the so-called pagan world. In pre-Christian times, there was great art, we may surmise, and in many cases, we have plenty of evidence. Ancient music can hardly be reconstructed, and huge parts of ancient painting were not preserved. But Greek architecture survived. So did Greek sculpture, mainly through Roman copies, barring some exceptions, like statues fished from the shipwrecked carriers that brought them from Greece to Italy. Greek and Latin literature produced masterpieces, a selection of which was kept and remained models for later writers. Nevertheless, a surprise awaits us, which gives evidence of a momentous shift in the understanding of art. We modern people, in all European languages, speak of the fine arts, beaux-arts, schöne Künste, belle arti, bellas artes, izobrazitelnoje искусство, and of course, sztuki piękne, thereby implying that there obtains a strong link between art and beauty. For us, at least till a certain point of time, which I will mention later on, it was taken for granted that the goal of art should be the production of things of beauty, to borrow the famous phrase of John Keats, although the Romantic poet gives as examples of such things natural beings like heavenly bodies or trees. Yet, beauty and art do not simply belong together as the goal and the means. When Greek thinkers discussed the beautiful, which they did in plenty, they seldom mentioned art as a means to bring about the beautiful. In the Phaedrus, Plato saw beauty as being, among all the ideas, the most splendidly visible and worthy of being loved, ekphanestaton kai erasmiotaton. Beauty sweeps us out of ourselves and brings us to another, higher dimension. But Plato's opinion on art is hardly favorable. In his Republic, he hardly pampers poetry and painting. His Socrates expels poets from the ideal city he is sketching. He reduces poetry to a merely instrumental role, and supposed it could foster beauty, this would be the moral beauty of the virtuous warrior citizen. As for painting, it is simply demoted as a mere way to ape things that are themselves images of true realities. 6 centuries later, but still in Plato's wake, Plotinus wrote two treatises on beauty. A passage from the second, later treatise qualifies Plato's demotion of imitative arts by explaining that the sculptor does not copy visible reality, but rather the idea present in the soul. This insight, already present in Cicero and taken up by later authors, had a tremendous influence on the artists and thinkers of the Italian Renaissance. A passage is especially revealing, I quote, "The soul must be trained, first of all, to look at beautiful ways of life, then at beautiful works, not those which the arts produce, uk hossa hai teknai ergadzontai, but the works of men who have made a name for goodness." Plotinus is obviously alluding to the ladder of ascension towards the beautiful, such as it is presented in Plato's Symposium. When he reaches a second rung, he is eager to remind the reader that the ergon, which he has to contemplate, is not the work of art. In the same treatise, some lines after the passage I have just quoted, Plotinus mentions sculpture, but only as a metaphor. For them, if the beautiful was produced, this happened rather by action than by production, rather by praxis than by poiesis. If the distinction, if we can bring to bear the distinction proposed by Aristotle on this issue. To be sure, this has something to do with the social reality of the ancient world, in which production was the task of the slaves, and action, mainly political action, was the job of the free citizens. In any case, a moral meaning was linked up to the aesthetic dimension and even eclipsed it. To kalon was the noble more than the beautiful. As a consequence, no full-fledged theory of the arts could possibly arise. Later on, in Renaissance Italy, painters and sculptors had to salvage the dignity of their profession from the stain left on them by their alleged belonging to the mechanical, or servile arts. In the Middle Ages, the beautiful is one of the transcendental properties of being, at least if we are to trust Saint Bonaventura, who added the beautiful to the classical list of four, being one, true, good. For his contemporary Aquinas, the beautiful is nothing more than a certain aspect of the good. And again, the focus was not on art as such. This pagan and medieval view of things was very much in keeping with the teaching of the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. Mentioning it, let me reminding you, is not a side issue over against the task that was entrusted to me of speaking about Christianity. For Christianity has its roots in the experience which the people of Israel made with God. Now, the Old Testament seldom speaks of art. To be sure, the Torah mentions and praises the artists who built the instruments of the cult in the sanctuary. It even singles out two craftsmen whom the Bible calls by name, Bezalel and Aholiab. It even says that they were, quote, filled with the Spirit of God in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship. We have there the first occurrence of the idea of an inspiration given by some divine power and leading the person who receives it not to prophecy, but to artistic craftsmanship. Interestingly, this biblical idea is a bridge leading to the Greek idea of the divine inspiration, not of the prophet, but of the poet. Hesiod's narrative about the mission he claimed to have received from the Muses strikingly resembles the way the prophet Amos legitimizes his own mission as given by the God of Israel, both having to justify their activity as amateurs because they were not card-carrying members of an acknowledged guild of professional singers of prophets. Needless to say that this biblical passage, and generally meaning the idea of inspiration, was heavily drawn upon by Christian artists who wanted to provide their trade with a theological ground. Nevertheless, the crucial utterance in the Hebrew Bible might have been God's own satisfaction when bringing the world into being, according to the first narrative of creation in book Genesis. On the close of every day, God looks at what he has just called into being and finds it good. On the sixth day, after the whole show has been completed, he adds that it was very good. It is interesting to observe that this judgment of the quality of the work done has as its object precisely a work, something that has been wrought, brought into being, and not a fact which simply is there. I vaguely said quality because the Hebrew adjective for which I have kept the traditional rendering, i.e. good, the adjective being tov, in fact means pleasant, agreeable, and in many cases, beautiful. Hence, we witness some closeness between the two ideas of work and of beauty. Anyway, there obtains a deep agreement in ancient pre-Christian culture, an agreement which bridges the gap between Athens and Jerusalem about the fundamental goodness of whatever exists. This basic assumption was not challenged by the Christian revelation. There was great art in Christendom. This is a fact, so obvious that nobody could possibly gainsay it. Yet, a question should be asked. Was this a Christian art, properly speaking. To be sure, the bulk of the pictorial legacy of former generations is religious in nature, and more precisely, Christian. Scenes from the Bible, Old as well as New Testaments, furnished a repertory of themes for classical painting and sculpture. But so did the religions of India. Furthermore, there was great art in classical China, and Chinese art was certainly not Christian, and more often than not even religious in nature. Now, the representative character of Christian painting is directly in keeping with the way in which God chose to address mankind, i.e., by taking a visible form. According to St. Paul, who, by the way, never saw Jesus in the flesh, Christ is the one who makes visible the invisible Father, his image, eikon tu theou tu aoratu. And according to the anonymous author of the Epistle to the Hebrews, he was the effulgence, apaugasma, of God's glory. In the fourth Gospel, Jesus says, "Who saw me saw the Father." The theologians who made the use of icons legitimate drew heavily upon those texts. Nevertheless, for Christianity, the beautiful is paradoxical in nature. It reaches its peak in Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, hardly a beautiful spectacle. The crucified Christ suffered the punishment reserved for slaves, was tortured, and poked fun at. He was ugly, but not even with a whiff of sublimity, and he was ridiculous, rather the summit of horror and scandal. Furthermore, the model on which the narrative of the Passion was told, and perhaps even on which Jesus consciously molded himself, the suffering servant of the Deutero-Isaiah, is explicitly said to lack beauty and glamour. The Septuagint translation rendered the second part of the same verse, "no beauty that we should desire him," according to the Hebrew, on the basis of an alternative reading by the Greek, in which concepts of eidos and kallos, words which for philosophers are heavily loaded. The German literary scholar Erich Auerbach The German literary scholar Erich Auerbach, a Jew who taught comparative literature of the Romance languages in Yale, came up with a fascinating thesis on the origin of European literature. According to him, literary realism, a tradition which pervades the whole history of this literature, was not possible in ancient times. What he means with realism is the serious, sober description of human reality in all its dimensions. In the ancient world, a strict division of labor obtained. Two styles, two stylistic levels divided the realm of narration. Stories of gods and heroes had to be told in the sublime style of epic and tragedy. What happened to low people and even slaves was told in the vulgar style of comedy. Now, the frontier between the noble and the base was done away with by Christianity. To be precise, by the central event narrated in the Gospels. In them, the Passion of Christ, a particularly base event, is told in a lofty, sublime style. Well, I skip the quotation from Auerbach to point out that earlier than Auerbach, another German, the philosopher Karl Rosenkranz, a disciple of Hegel, published a work in 1853 whose paradoxical title captures pretty adequately the intention, Aesthetic of the Ugly. And this is what he says, quote, with Christian religion, which knew evil in its roots and who taught how to overcome it, ugliness were completely introduced in the world of art. Now let's have a look at a counter proof. And this counter example is Islam. According to Islamic dogmatics, in principle, not in fact, but in principle, making images of any living being whatsoever is forbidden. This remains in the wake of the Hebrew Bible, which forbids what it calls idolatry, the cult of images, and as a consequence, their production is forbidden too. The prohibition is not to be read in the Quran, but in some utterances ascribed to the Prophet. The reason given is that the artist is not able to breathe life into the animal whose image he painted or sculpted. When asked to do so on Doomsday, he will be in dire straits. As a consequence, no painting could develop, barring in the early Umayyad period when the prohibition was not yet enforced, and perhaps when the hadith had not yet been forged. On the other hand, there was an art of the miniature which reached a very exquisite level of refinement, mainly in Persia. But it consisted for the most part in illustrating literary narratives. For instance, Firdausi's Shahnameh. On the other hand, and as some sort of compensation of balance weight, Islam developed the art of calligraphy. To be precise, the art of beautiful writing had been known in China for centuries. But for the Chinese script in ideograms, Islam transferred it to alphabetic writing. Moreover, decoration with floral motifs for plants were allowed, unlike animals. Decoration with floral motifs was quite common, and the same can be said of geometric figures which didn't represent any definite object. Kant, the German philosopher Kant, chose non-figurative art as the best example of what he called pulchritudo vaga, free beauty, in contradistinction of floating beauty, in contradistinction to the pulchritudo adherence of figurative arts, the beauty which sticks to the object. Interestingly, the typical form of Islamic art, whose name betrays its origin, the arabesque, has become in Christendom a favorite metaphor for the modern work of art, which doesn't need any longer to represent any concrete object. As for the word arabesque, it may have been first used as the book title by the painter Giovanni Paolo Lomazzo, a so-called manierist, a pupil of Caravaggio, who penned a collection of pieces in the Milanese dialect and had it printed in 1589 under the title of Rabisque, which is the dialect form for arabesque. In the first half of the 19th century, the word became a favorite title in Romantic literature all over the Western world. In Russia with Nikolai Gogol, in the United States with Edgar Poe. The same happened in music, again all over Europe with Robert Schumann, Franz Liszt, and the later Claude Debussy. As for the theoretical use of the word, it had to wait for Friedrich Schlegel, who wrote, quote, "The arabesque is the oldest and most original form of human imagination. I consider the arabesque to have been a most particular and essential form or way of expression of poetry." Both sentences by Schlegel are to be found in a dialogue on poetry, which to some extent mirrors discussions held by male and female persons, all active in intellectual walks of life in late 18th century Jena, the German town. There were the philosopher Schelling, the theologian Schleiermacher, the true brothers Schlegel, and some ladies. The first sentence about arabesque as being the original form of imagination is put into the mouth of Ludovico, who is perhaps the philosopher Schelling, in a speech on mythology. The second belonging to a speech on the novel held by Antonio. I don't know who Antonio was. I will get back to Schlegel in no time. 2 generations later, the French poet Baudelaire, perhaps our greatest poet, followed suit, who called arabesque, quote, "the most spiritualist kind of drawing." Well, up to now, art and beauty were thought as belonging together. With the early German Romanticism of the Jena period, what had been considered for centuries, for Christian centuries, as obvious, hence as requiring no explicit mention, was shaken. A new separation occurred, the same as in ancient thought, but in the reverse direction. Whereas Greek philosophy in the Platonic tradition had beauty without art, modernity has art without beauty. Friedrich Schlegel ventured at the end of the 18th century a momentous step. The proper object of art is not the beautiful any longer, but the interesting. Quote, "The beautiful is not the ideal of modern poetry, and it is essentially different from the interesting." The interesting could become the basic object of art precisely because Kant, the philosopher, has freed the sentiment of the beautiful from its link with the interest by defining it as interesselose Wohlgefallen, satisfaction without the uninterested satisfaction, thereby made possible what I could call a disinterested interest. We are interested in things, but they have no payoff. To be sure, what tickles our interest can be beautiful, but it has not to be so. The grotesque, the shocking, the monstrous, and so on and so forth, can be as interesting as the beautiful, and even more so. Schlegel mentioned elsewhere the new, the racy, the German is piquant, the striking, and the German again is frappant. Well, the German, it's French, in fact, Germanized French. The French poet Victor Hugo, in the preface he wrote in 1827 for a drama of his own, Cromwell, explained this in a bombastic style, although he preferred to speak of the grotesque as the main aesthetic category which he stood for. What decides whether a production of art is a work of art or not is the reaction, not necessarily an active decision, the reaction of the onlooker, reader, listener, and so on. Arts gets thereby under the yoke of subjectivity. Hence a bevy of consequences. First, the work produced must be able to arouse the interest of the subject. Therefore, it must be somehow shocking. The artist's personality becomes more decisive than the works that he or she produces. The artist is swept into a whirlwind of concurring attempts at drawing the attention of the subject. This may be the case even when the artist has to play the fool in order to be considered as an artist, more precisely as leading the life of an artist. An artist without any work is not a contradiction any longer. What is important is that the would-be artist should lead the bohemian life of an artist. Beauty, as such, I beg your pardon, beauty can be tolerated insofar as it enters the realm of technology. The name art takes, the name that art takes when it enters the realm of technology is design. A Frenchman who made his whole career in the US, Raymond Loewy, came up in 1951 with a book by the title of Never Leave Well Enough Alone. The French translation has a title which, in my opinion, is more interesting. Ugliness sells badly. Well, in front of such phenomena, we have to ask whether art still has a meaning in the modern world, regardless of the Christian, non-Christian, or post-Christian character of the said world. Now, a powerful voice answered with a negative. I mean the German philosopher Hegel, with his famous thesis about the past character of art. Hegel reflected on art in a series of lecture courses which he called by the name of aesthetics. The word stems directly from the Greek word for sensory perception, aesthesis. But its use in German was still recent, since it had been minted by the philosopher Baumgarten, who, by the way, wrote Latin, by whom who meant thereby, beg your pardon, the general theory of sensory knowledge, and not a theory of art. And Hegel himself confesses that he would have preferred the word kabbalistic, the doctrine of the beautiful. But his object was not the beautiful in the whole breadth of its manifestations in nature, for instance, but the beautiful in art only. Anyway, there Hegel observed that art, as the highest expression of truth, belongs to the past. What is interesting in Hegel is that he clearly understood that this relative demotion of art was the result of Christian faith. Art is not the highest way for modern man to enact truth. Truth is given us in a clearer way, according to Hegel, in Christian revelation and not in art. Art is only a secondary way for us to experience truth. We find, interestingly, very much the same idea in a philosopher who had almost nothing to do with Hegel, Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger, who devoted a lengthy and deep contribution to the question of the work of art and its origin, is the title of the essay, The Origin of the Work of Art. Now, the words beauty and beautiful are not in the center. What has this place is rather truth. Beauty is a way in which truth, well, is there. Interestingly, in the very first version of this conference of 1935, those words about beauty are simply absent. The focus is on art. Not a single word in the first version of the essay about beauty. The snag is that truth, the truth which is supposed to be set at work in Heidegger's lecture. Truth, which may remain linked up with beauty, is separated from the good. Art loses any moral dimension, so that something like art for art's sake becomes possible. Art can't possibly be a window opening on some transcendence. And what is left? What is left when transcendence is no longer there? Receive the moniker of culture. There is a small passage in the novel by Thomas Mann, Dr. Faustus. We read a dialogue between the central character of the novel, the composer Adrian Leverkühn, and the devil in person. And the devil mentions the separation between Kultur and Kultus, culture and cult in English. And his thesis is that since the link between culture and cult does not exist any longer, well, art must degenerate. Art must shrink into, well, entertainment. Well, about our present situation, which was the main theme of this conference. Well, we can hardly answer a question about art and modernity without an assessment of what modernity is all about, which is a tall order. And we're realizing that the whirlwind of modernity draws to it the whole of human life. I tried to do that elsewhere and need not repeat what was the topic of several books already. In the present time, a time in which we can't help living for the better and for the worse, we have to evaluate what is positive and what is negative for Christianity. On the one hand, art has lost its relationship to beauty for now a matter of 2 centuries. More generally, art has lost its possible relationship with the metaphysical dimension of reality. We saw that the fundamental object of artistic production, according to modern thought, is the interesting. Now, the interesting can't possibly be convertible with the other transcendentals any longer. We can say that everything is one true, and good, insofar as it is being. And we can convert those transcendentals into one another and say whatever is good, whatever is true, whatever is good is true, and so on and so forth. But we can scarcely say that anything whatsoever is interesting. For we do experience the contrary, i.e. the boring. And there is plenty of boring things. Rather, nothing is boring in itself, but we experience boredom, which is the flip side of our reducing the beautiful to subjectivity, to what we find interesting. The boring is the interesting which ceases to arouse our interest, in the same way as the disgusting is what tickled our palate when we are not hungry any longer. At the beginning of the 19th century, more precisely between the Congress of Vienna and the revolutions of 1848, i.e. during the era of monarchic restorations, the German Vormärz, for literary historians, the late Romantic, we find all over Europe thinkers who give the experience of boredom a literary or philosophical expression, just after the watershed which was represented by Schlegel's reduction of the beautiful to the interesting. It was the price to be paid, or the punishment. Among writers and poets, let us mention Lord Byron on boredom, the French Alfred de Musset on ennui, the Russian Pushkin on skúka, the Italian Leopardi on noia, and among philosophers, Schopenhauer described human life as alternating boredom and pain, and Kierkegaard meditated on boredom as well in his The Alternative, Inter alia. This I can only mention en passant. As a consequence, in order to stave off boredom, artists have to change styles, to change subjects as quickly as possible. Hence, a thirst for originality, which can hardly be quenched. They even have to enlarge the received definition of art in order to introduce into it practices that had up to now hardly anything to do with art. I'm thinking of the so-called installations of more contemporary, the so-called contemporary art. The trouble being that, as Leopardi, whom I've just been quoted, very clearly saw, the very variety in change produces boredom. Now, as far as our present situation towards beauty is concerned, beauty as such doesn't fare better in the other realm in which it is present, i.e. nature. Natural beauty was debunked by the two uncrowned kings of late modernity, Arthur Schopenhauer and Charles Darwin. Both contend, each in his own style, that beauty is in the service of reproduction, hence of the will to live, a will which does care a fig for the happiness of the individual, but whose only aim is the survival of the species. This is Schopenhauer's thesis in his Metaphysics of Sexuality. And Darwin had the hypothesis that, for instance, the bright colors of flowers are traps for insects, which will be drawn to them, carry pollen from flower to flower, and ensure the reproduction of the species. Now, this situation, the demotion of beauty, could be a chance for Christianity. And as a consequence, it may, if not foster, at least make possible a renewal of Christian art. The temptation of idolizing beauty recedes. Some sort of religion of art was dreamt of in the late 19th century among some circles of refined aesthetes all over Europe. In the present times, such a religion is hardly thinkable. This doesn't mean that the temptation of idolatry was definitely staved off. Calvin, the French Reformator, the Geneva leader, Calvin put his finger on the sore point when he said that the human mind has always been a factory of idols. He says in French, the boutique, in French of the 16th century. On the contrary, other idols replaced art. And I'm afraid they may prove far more cruel and dangerous. Nation, class, race are certainly way more dangerous than beauty. On the other hand, for Christians at least, art can develop itself as instrumental to revelation. Art has to accept some humility, an ancillary function. This is, by the way, exactly what it did during the centuries of Christian art. There was no such thing as an artist, a character which was born in the Renaissance. There were craftsmen who did their job as well as possible and did not consider themselves as endowed with any sacred mission. They aimed at helping the prayer of the faithful, which was the heart of the matter. The leading metaphor for a possible renewal of Christian art could be an objet d'art itself, the monstrance. In a monstrance, the rich splendor of the material, gold, silver, and the delicacy of the ornaments wrought in precious metal and precious stones don't have any other function than concentrating the gaze of the onlooker on the small, colorless host, thereby enabling Eucharistic contemplation. As a conclusion, I already mentioned the theory of the transcendentals on two occasions. First, I reminded you of the classical doctrine of medieval scholasticism, the system of the main properties which run across the categories which divide being. Then observed that the interesting, that is the central concept of modern aesthetics, doesn't belong among those transcendental properties. The trouble is that the older, more basic assumption common to Greek and biblical thought, the basic assumption of the fundamental goodness of being, is now challenged. Retrieving Christian art and retrieving art tout court can hardly be possible without a rediscovery of the transcendentals and of their convertibility. Retrieving the beautiful is a fascinating and rewarding task. But we can hardly begin with the beautiful. Rather, we should first rehabilitate the true and the good as belonging to being. By this token, the problem of art, if there is such a problem, is not to be solved on the level of art itself. Most probably, art will go on to produce the better and the worse. Artists, be they real or only would-be artists, people who pretend to be artists, will keep producing works. Among the latter, crooks will keep playing pranks on the public and selling their works to patsies of all ilk. Real artists will go on with their job. What we should do would be to enable a revival of art, but not by creating works of art, by giving art its foundation, the background on which it can become visible again. And this background is metaphysical in nature. This would be a recovery, a rediscovery of the transcendentals, and especially of the link which obtains between the true, the good, and the beautiful. And in order to do that, we need no artists. Artists will do their job. But we need, for this kind of endeavor, philosophers who would be at the same time saints. We had such a philosopher recently canonized, and I'm very happy to have been invited to give this lecture as a John Paul II lecture. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Remy. Thank you for your thank you for this deep and erudite lecture, very elegant. At the same time, I would like to say thank you for your beautiful lecture when we are talking about beauty. Let me now ask a few questions, not maybe directly all of them will be connected with the lecture, but it's a very wide sphere of beauty and art. It's pretty easy today, especially the people who are involved in the classical thinking, like the person present here, to complain on today art. But frankly speaking, looking at the everyday life of today's church, one gets the impression that the Catholic Church no longer loves fine art. Even more, no longer loves beauty in general. We often hear that Catholic Church should be involved in charity. Rarely or never one says that the Church should be involved in culture or art. If you agree with this opinion, please answer whether this phenomenon is a kind of, I don't know, Protestantization of Catholic Christianity, or whether there are other reasons behind it. No, Remy, yes.
Okay, can you hear me now? Well, I'm afraid that for some reason I couldn't hear a large part of your question. I could listen to the beginning and to the very end when you asked the question, but I'm afraid I could not grasp the reasons why you were raising such a question about a possible Protestantization, or you name it, of Catholic thought.
I can repeat.
Yes, please go ahead.
I can repeat the question. The question is that I have a feeling that in today's church life, fine art and beauty is absent. I mean, there is a kind of a pressure for Catholic Church to be involved in charity, for example. But I rarely hear that it should be involved in culture or art, or even as you say in the end of your lecture, on building a metaphysical background for art. So the question is, do you agree generally with that opinion that beauty left Catholic Church and no one really cares? And what's the reason of that phenomenon? The Protestantization may be one of the answer, but I'm interested in your answer, not in mine.
Well, this is quite a wide field of problems and questions for us, and this requires some sort of examination of our own conscience. Well, it's a fact that churchmen, or church people generally meaning, have sort of lost their interest. Sorry to come back to this concept, which I have debunked in my lecture, but there's a great deal of Christian people now, of committed Christians even, who sort of don't care for, not exactly for art, but for the way in which in liturgy, the mystery, the core of the Christian mystery is somehow made present through a series of mediations which belong to performing arts, and in particular to music, to representative arts, painting, sculpture, things like that, so that what is essential in Christianity is relegated to to what can be uttered in speech. And liturgy, well, is not something that is said. What is said in the Mass, for instance, is what is read from the Holy Scriptures. But what is done is far more important. And now the very idea of a sacred action, of something that can be done as repetition of the central deed of Christ, slowly recedes out of our ken. And this might be what you try to capture by your idea of a Protestantization, the focus being more on God's word than on God's action. The word being considered as the Holy Writ and not as God's word in Christ, or God's word who is Christ. And this is why, well, in my opinion, there are secondary causes, i.e., well, bad education, generally meaning. The fact that liturgy is not taught as seriously as it used to be. Okay, but the central point is that the very nature of the Christian phenomenon, of a Christian fact, I prefer to speak of a fact, the central nature of the fact, i.e. God doing things in history, God not only parachuting a message, a holy book, a holy writ, but entering the fabric of human history is no longer taken as seriously as it used to be. It probably was taken seriously in an implicit way. People probably were not very much conscious of the importance of what was done and what had to be done in order to enter the drama of salvation, in order for us to become players on the scene on which the scene of the play written by God, so to speak, if I may use this image. And well, that's why I said that the solution to the problems of art is not to be looked for in art itself, but in something which I called, for want of anything better, by the adjective of metaphysical, i.e., the highest level of our relationship with God, and of the relationship of the whole of creation with the Creator. If we don't climb to this level, or if we don't dig down to this level, I can see little hope for a renewal of Christian art. Great Christian artists were people who prayed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, but of course, well, so you think that the living idea of beauty
Mm-hmm.
can hold on to any consistently atheistic system of thought, or it's impossible?
A living idea of beauty.
Mm-hmm. Can exist in the, let's say, atheistic system of thought, or it's just impossible for in a longer distance?
And this would be, in any case, quite a paradoxical kind of beauty. Well, I tried to put my finger on this point after many other people, after better people. The central fact, the central manifestation of what is, of the depth of what is, i.e., Christ's cross, is not exactly beautiful. Even if there were wonderful paintings representing Christ's crucifixion, the very fact that God chose to show himself in the figure of the servant, and of the suffering servant of the second Isaiah, well, shows us that beauty has an intrinsically paradoxical nature. Beauty is not what satisfies us. Beauty is not what pleases. Crucifixion is highly unpleasant, not only for the victim, but for the onlooker, with the exception of people who jeered at him and who said, well, you could save other people, why don't you save yourself? And whereas for us, the central phenomenon is precisely the fact that God is not interested, so to speak, in saving oneself, in saving himself, because he is there only for him to give, not to receive. And well, this kind of beauty can be made more visible, but not but no visible beauty, and in particular, no beauty that could be produced by artistic activity can get to the center and get to the central point. The central point is, on the contrary, obscure. Obscure. This is love, love giving itself without its waiting for any answer, without caring even for any reception, let alone for any, let's say, exchange or any give and take. And well, we are beyond beauty. And beauty, beams forth from an invisible center, which is, God's love.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
well,
if I ask you about,
sorry, just to add a point, probably Aquinas was right. Probably was right in telling us that beauty is not a last thing. Beauty is only the effulgence of goodness and or of truth. But
Yeah,
beauty in itself is sort of secondary.
That's what I wanted to ask you, because when we say fine art, it's we always Christians have in mind that the word beauty doesn't appear in the New Testament. And if I ask you to choose one key word for Christian art, and I suggest you beauty, true, or the bridge between to reality, or many you can choose. I mean, is the beauty really the key words and key category, not the true, not the bridge, or something which give us a way or give us a direction?
This is quite a good question. Well, perhaps the key word, if I had to choose only one word to capture the essence of Christian art, it would be, withdrawing, leaving space for opening up a place so that something which is not beautiful in itself, but which makes beauty possible, which makes every beautiful thing possible, could appear, but appear in a paradoxical way. You know, I'm thinking of what the Greek fathers, with whom you are especially familiar, said when they spoke about revelation, and they have this weird phrase, phenomenos cryptetai. He hides himself by showing himself, and shows himself by hiding himself. You know, this is the core paradox of Christian art and of beauty in the created world. This would be my word, perhaps my last word. Yeah? Then withdrawing, perhaps service, giving place and to making place, and trying to sort of to, if I may say so, to play the part of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, which is never visible, it is never visible or she is never visible, because that's feminine in Hebrew, as you know. Well, the spirit doesn't step onto the scene, but he makes visible. He, she, or it makes visible, and he or she makes visible the Father on the figure of the Son. Well, that's Saint Basil's treatise on the Holy Spirit, as you know. Now, there is something like that, you know. Our part consists in, well, forgetting ourselves and making behind us, inside of us, higher than us, visible the one, our maker, our creator.
Mhm. That's also partly an answer on my first question about the problem with the lack of art in nowadays church, because that space doesn't exist.
I can hear you very badly.
I say
There must
that,
be something the matter with your mic. Or,
hello.
yeah,
How is it now?
that's slightly better.
Slightly better. So maybe I try with a microphone, but I try to ask a question from audience.
Mhm.
Hear me, Remy? Remy, do you hear me?
Yes, to some extent.
To some extent.
Not loud and clear, I'm afraid.
I try like that. Maybe now will be. Now is it better? No?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Better. Okay, thank you so
Go
much.
ahead.
Maybe it's really a problem with my microphone. Hello?
Yep. I'm with you.
Now I have a question which is coming from the audience.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading it. Charles Darwin and Arthur Schopenhauer aim to end the story of the concept of natural beauty. Have representatives of classical metaphysics in which beauty and being are related found an answer to this criticism?
Well, first of all, I mentioned Schopenhauer and Darwin not because I consider them as being my patron saints, but it so happens that their influence in the second half of the 19th century was simply overwhelming. Almost each and every European artist, writer, musician was under the spell of those, first of Schopenhauer, and for people who had a taste for natural science, of Darwin. A philosopher like Nietzsche, who is at present, the uncrowned king of a European intelligentsia, began as a disciple of Schopenhauer and expressed his ideas in the Zarathustra, under the garb of Charles Darwin's idea of natural evolution. Okay. If we are to discuss the thoughts of those people, we'll have to enter a field in which natural science and philosophy are to be met with the same weapons as the ones they wield, i.e., an answer to Darwinian idea of evolution, evolution being a fact, but the doctrine underneath is something different. We have to discuss this on the scientific level. As for Schopenhauer, we'll have to discuss him too on the philosophical level. For instance, by showing that, his explanation of whatever on the basis of will, well, doesn't account for a great deal of phenomena, but we'll have to discuss them on their own level and to fight them with their own weapons, and not. It's not enough, in my opinion, simply to get back to a pre-modern view of things, or we'll get sort of trapped in our own citadel. We'll be in our dungeon, and from there we won't be able to do anything. We'll be able to speak only to people who share our faith, which is not enough. We are not there in order to congratulate each other, but to propose, to give, if possible, faith to other people. And well, how could we possibly get back? Well, my first answer would be quite simple and quite pedagogic in nature. Let's try to read those old books. Greek and medieval thinkers, people who are in my back, sort of, for this is the section of my personal library in which I have medieval things and modern things too. There's Spinoza and other people there, and Montaigne. Well, let's first try to really read and understand those people, not use them as ideological tools, but as teachers who could, well, communicate deep and interesting things about them. And perhaps we'll discover, I said perhaps, we'll discover that what they have to tell us is far more interesting, far more revealing, and sheds more light on reality such as we experience it than those two fellows, Schopenhauer, the German, and the Brit, whom I mentioned earlier. Just let's try, and we'll see that they are rewarding.
Thank you very much for your answer and for your lecture. Let me come with one memory. Years ago, we had an opening of the institute, and we've listened to your lecture it was the first lecture of the Institute of Culture of St. John Paul II. Now we have first anniversary of our institute and 101st anniversary of our patron, Karol Wojtyła. It's precisely today, and let me say a word because of that, because the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, a year after its inauguration, at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, is expanding its activities by launching a year-long program called JP2 Studies. It's a unique proposal, I really believe, to study the thought and intellectual heritage of John Paul II. And registration for this program begins today, 18th May, exactly in the 101st anniversary of the birth of Karol Wojtyła. So the doors of the Angelicum are open to students from all around the world to study John Paul II heritage. And I would say that among many scholars, we have a pleasure to have your lectures. Thank you very much, Remy.
Very welcome.
Remy, for that. So students have a chance, and if I'm not wrong, in the second semester to listen to your lecture on Christian culture, but I would say that you are in a very good companion, because George Weigel will be teaching here life and work of John Paul II. Francis Hittinger will be talking about social philosophy on John Paul II. And for example, Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, will have a lecture on solidarity, also very Wojtyla's subject, whom he is inspired. We have also a very good team from Poland. Jarosław Kupczak, one I think of a best specialist in Wojtyla's theology, Marek Cichocki, whom you know, also, and many others. Students may have also a contact with the theater dimension of Wojtyla history, because they will be preparing his Job, his first theatrical play, and they have a chance to travel to Poland to see the plays connected with John Paul II. So that's today's very first beginning. So I'm sorry to interrupt our ending with that, but it's a chance to say it in your presence. So thank you very much, and thank you again for your lecture. Thank you very much to our audience, and I would like to invite you to the next lecture from the JP2 lecture series. It's a Formal Europe and Vital Europe, Tradition as the Ground of the Identity, by Professor Renato Cristin, and the lecture will take place on May 20. Now, thank you very much. Thank you to all our audience. Thank you, Remy. For your...
I thank you for your invitation.
Thank you, and I hope we see...
It's a great honor for me.
We see soon in internet, or hopefully in...
I do hope we'll be able to see each other in the flesh.
Yes.
In the near future.
That's a dream. Thank you very much. Have a good